On the border of Nevada and Arizona, one of the most vital reservoirs in America is sitting far below where it used to be. As of June 19, 2026, federal data placed Lake Mead near 1,046 feet at Hoover Dam. The reservoir held about 7.4 million acre-feet of water, roughly 28% of its available capacity. From a distance, that sounds like a dry water statistic. But in the American West, a low reservoir does not stay at the shoreline. It moves. It climbs into the water bill. It creeps into the electric bill. It can change the cost of growing food, the cost of building homes, the budget of a city, and the decisions families make at the kitchen table. That is what makes Lake Mead different. The crisis is not just that the lake is lower than people remember. The crisis is that an entire region was built around the assumption that water could be stored, moved, pumped, priced, and promised across enormous distances for decades. And now, that margin is shrinking. The white ring around Lake Mead is the visible warning. But the hidden warning is much quieter. It does not look like a dramatic disaster scene. It looks like a normal house in Phoenix, a restaurant in Las Vegas, a farm field in Arizona, a power line stretching across the desert, a family opening another bill and wondering why normal life keeps getting more expensive. That is why Lake Mead is not just a water crisis. It is a cost of living signal. When a reservoir drops, the water does not simply disappear from a map. The cost of replacing it, conserving it, moving it, negotiating it, and fighting over it begins to show up somewhere else. And the strange part is this: the tap does not have to run dry for the crisis to reach ordinary people. The first sign may be a restriction, then a fee, then a higher rate, then a farm that plants less. Then a city that has to spend more to secure the same future it once assumed was guaranteed. The lake is the visible crisis. The bill is the warning. To understand why, we have to look at the detail most headlines leave out. Lake Mead is not just a body of water. It is a ledger. Every foot of water inside it is connected to promises made across 7 states, cities that keep growing, farms that need irrigation, power customers who depend on hydropower, and communities that have built normal life around a river that has to be divided before it ever reaches the tap. When most people see Lake Mead, they see the bathtub ring. They see the stranded boat ramps. They see the exposed rock. But water managers see something else. They see storage. They see allocations. They see legal obligations. They see delivery systems. They see the widening gap between what the river promised on paper and what the weather is delivering in real life. That difference is where the real cost begins. The Colorado River system supports roughly 35 to 40 million people, depending on how the system is counted. It is tied to about 5.5 million acres of farmland. Federal sources describe agriculture as the largest demand pressure, with agricultural uses depending on about 70% of Colorado River water. That does not mean one group caused the crisis. It means the river is doing more than most people realize. It is not just filling reservoirs. It is helping grow winter vegetables. It is helping support livestock. It is helping anchor farms, suburbs, construction, restaurants, hotels, electric utilities, tribal communities, and entire desert economies. So when Lake Mead drops, the story becomes more than a shoreline problem. It becomes a high-stakes negotiation over who cuts back first, who pays more, who gets protected, who gets delayed, and who discovers that the cost of living in the West was partly built on a water system with less room for error than people wanted to believe. A reservoir stores water, but it also stores confidence. Confidence that cities can keep growing. Confidence that farms can keep planting. Confidence that electricity can keep flowing. Confidence that families can keep paying for ordinary life without thinking too much about where the water came from. Once that confidence starts to shrink, the crisis changes shape. It stops looking like a landscape problem. It starts looking like a monthly budget problem. This did not happen overnight. For years, the Colorado River system has been losing the cushion that once made the West feel secure. Dry years came. Hot years came. Snowpack failed to deliver what the system needed, even as cities kept planning, farms kept planting, and families kept moving into desert communities. By July 2022, federal end-of-month data placed Lake Mead around 1,040.92 feet, a major low reference point in the modern story of the reservoir. That number mattered because it showed how close the system had moved toward thresholds that once felt distant. Then, in later seasons, the lake rose somewhat, and that is where the story can become misleading. Because when a reservoir rises for a season, people can mistake movement for recovery. A wet winter can help. A strong snow year can buy time. A temporary improvement can make the shoreline look less alarming. But a system can gain water and still lose security. By the end of May 2026, Lake Mead was around 1,050 feet. By June 19, 2026, it was near 1,046 feet. That means the lake was not simply bouncing back into a comfortable old normal. It was still operating in a world increasingly shaped by shortage rules, weak runoff, and negotiations over what comes next. For 2026 operations, federal officials projected Lake Mead in a Level 1 shortage condition. Under those rules, Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico were expected to contribute specific water reductions or savings. Arizona's figure was 512,000 acre-feet. Nevada's was 21,000 acre-feet. Mexico's was 80,000 acre-feet. Those numbers are not household rationing numbers. They are system numbers. But system numbers eventually shape local decisions. They influence water agencies. They influence farms. They influence cities. They influence what kind of conservation gets funded, what kind of growth gets approved, and how much it costs to make the future look stable. And the timing matters. The current operating guidelines for the Colorado River system are approaching their end after 2026. That means the West is not just dealing with a low reservoir. It is dealing with a deadline. A deadline for states. A deadline for water agencies. A deadline for farmers, cities, tribes, power users, and everyone whose future depends on how the river is divided when there is not enough certainty left. Each time the system gets close to the edge, officials do not simply wait for rain. They renegotiate, they conserve, they move water, they fund projects, they delay decisions, they build new systems, they raise money. And somewhere eventually that money reaches ordinary life. It reaches a utility rate, a tax plan, a food price, a housing decision, a power contract, a city budget. The geography of the map explains why. The Colorado River runs about 100 miles through a basin covering roughly 250,000 square miles. The water people see at Lake Mead is not simply Nevada water or Arizona water. It is upstream snowpack. It is river flow. It is reservoir storage. It is a legal promise. It is a power source. It is farm supply. It is city planning. It is a line item in a household budget before most families ever think about it. To understand Lake Mead, you have to follow the water. First, snow falls in the mountains. Then it melts into the Colorado River system. Then water is stored upstream in Lake Powell. Then it moves through the Grand Canyon toward Lake Mead. Then Lake Mead becomes the great balancing point for the lower basin, a reservoir that helps serve cities, farms, tribes, power users, and water agencies across the desert Southwest. That cushion is what made the modern West feel possible. Cushion allowed cities to grow. Cushion allowed water agencies to plan years ahead. Cushion allowed farms to plant with more confidence. Cushion allowed electricity customers to benefit from hydropower. Cushion allowed families to move into desert suburbs without thinking every month about the snowpack hundreds of miles away. But once that cushion shrinks, geography turns into cost. A city may have to invest more in conservation. A water agency may have to pay more to secure supplies. A farm may face a harder decision about what to plant. A utility may have to plan around less hydropower flexibility. A homeowner may never see the reservoir, but still feel the cost of keeping the system stable. Lake Mead is being squeezed by three forces at the same time: natural pressure, system pressure, and cost pressure. The natural pressure is severe. The Colorado River system depends heavily on mountain snow. Not just rain in the desert. Not just a summer storm. Snow. Snow that builds in the mountains. Snow that melts at the right time. Snow that becomes runoff. Snow that moves downstream into a river system that millions of people rarely see but constantly depend on. In 2026, federal drought sources reported record-low snowpack in several Colorado River source states, and many runoff forecast points in the basin were expected to produce less than 30% of average runoff. The reservoir refills through physics, not hope. Snow becomes runoff. Runoff becomes river flow. River flow becomes reservoir storage. Reservoir storage becomes the cushion behind cities, farms, and power systems. When that chain weakens, the pressure does not arrive all at once. It moves slowly, then financially. The second force is system pressure. The Colorado River is not just water flowing downhill. It is a negotiated system. It is divided by rules, agreements, obligations, shortage tiers, and operating guidelines. Those rules decide who adjusts first, how much they adjust, and what happens when the system no longer has the margin it once depended on. And then comes the third force, cost pressure. This is the part that turns Lake Mead from a reservoir story into a normal life story. Because water does not only have to exist, it has to be captured, stored, released, pumped, treated, moved, conserved, reused, priced, and defended in public budgets. Every one of those steps costs money, and the lower the margin gets, the more expensive stability can become. That is the hidden mechanism. The crisis does not need to become a dramatic collapse to become expensive. It only needs to make the old system harder to operate. Natural pressure reduces the water. System pressure decides who adjusts. Cost pressure decides who pays. And once those three forces start moving together, the crisis becomes much larger than the lake itself. It becomes a question about the future of the West. Not just whether there will be water, but whether the water system that made normal life possible can still keep normal life affordable. The human cost does not always look like a person standing beside an empty shoreline. Sometimes it looks like a farmer staring at a field and deciding what not to plant. Sometimes it looks like a water manager trying to stretch a supply that used to feel more predictable. Sometimes it looks like a city approving growth while quietly asking whether the old assumptions still work. And sometimes it looks like a family that has never visited Lake Mead, opening a monthly bill and feeling a crisis they cannot see. In the Colorado River Basin, federal drought data has shown millions of acres of hay exposed to drought conditions, along with hundreds of thousands of acres of wheat and cotton. The same basin also includes large numbers of cattle and sheep affected by drought exposure. Those numbers do not mean every grocery bill changes overnight, but they do show something deeper. Water stress enters the food system before it enters the checkout line. It enters as planting decisions, irrigation limits, higher uncertainty, harder choices about which crops make sense, and pressure on rural economies where water is not just a resource. It is the thing that keeps work land and local tax bases alive. For a farmer, Lake Mead can become a decision about acreage. For a rancher, it can become a question about feed. For a small town, it can become a question about jobs. For a city, it can become a question about whether future growth can still be promised cheaply. And for a household, it can become the slow feeling that every basic part of life is getting more expensive at the same time. This is where Lake Mead leaves the map and enters normal life. Not as one giant bill with the words water crisis printed at the top. That would be easy to see. Instead, the cost arrives in pieces. First, water. In Arizona, the Central Arizona Project is a 336-mile system that moves Colorado River water towards some of the most populated parts of the state. That one fact changes the way a household should think about water. Because the bill is not only paying for water, it is helping pay for the system that makes distant water feel local. When the system has to spend more on conservation, shortage response, delivery planning, repayment, infrastructure, or backup planning, the cost can move through the agencies and utilities that keep normal life running. Then, power. Lake Mead is tied to Hoover Dam, and Hoover Dam is not just a landmark, it is a power source. Federal sources say Hoover Dam generates On average, about 4 billion kilowatt-hours of electricity per year for customers in Nevada, Arizona, and California, enough to serve about 1.3 million people. That does not mean one low lake level automatically creates one simple electric bill increase. But it does mean water storage and power planning are connected. When the reservoir system is stressed, the region has to think not only about drinking water, but about the energy value of water moving through dams, the reliability of replacement power, and the cost of keeping the grid stable when hydropower has less room to perform the way it once did. Then, food. The Colorado River system is tied to millions of acres of farmland. The same water that supports desert cities also supports crops, livestock, rural jobs, equipment dealers, trucking, processing, and grocery shelves far from the fields. So when water becomes more uncertain, the pressure can show up as planting decisions, fallowed acreage, feed costs, lower local income, and a food supply chain with less flexibility. Then housing. A desert city does not grow on land alone. It grows on infrastructure. It grows on water planning. It grows on the belief that a new subdivision, a new apartment complex, or a new business district can be served not just this year, but for decades. If growth requires more expensive water supplies, more reuse systems, more conservation programs, more legal certainty, and more infrastructure, then the cost of building and living in that place can change. The house may look the same, the monthly reality may not, and then taxes and fees. When water gets harder to guarantee, cities and agencies do not respond with one magic solution. They study, they negotiate, they build, they conserve, they repair, they finance, they ask residents to change behavior. They ask ratepayers to support systems that were once easier to take for granted. This is how a reservoir becomes a cost of living issue. Water risk becomes infrastructure spending. Infrastructure spending becomes rates and fees. Agricultural stress becomes food system pressure. Hydropower stress becomes energy planning. Growth uncertainty becomes housing cost. Public pressure becomes political negotiation. And the household receives the crisis after it has been translated into ordinary language. A bill, a price, a fee, a restriction, a delay, a higher cost to keep the same life. Now put the numbers together. One number alone can sound technical. A lake level, a storage figure, a shortage tier, a power statistic, a farm acreage number. But together, they form a map of pressure. As of June 19, 2026, federal data placed Lake Mead near 1,046 feet at Hoover Dam. The reservoir held about 7.4 million acre-feet of water. That was roughly 28% of its available capacity. Those numbers are not just about a lake. They are about the amount of cushion left in a system that helps support roughly 35 to 40 million people, depending on how the basin is counted. They are about a river system tied to about 5.5 million acres of farmland. They are about a region where federal sources describe agriculture as depending on about 70% of Colorado River water. They are about a dam that, on average, generates about 4 billion kilowatt-hours of electricity per year for customers in Nevada, Arizona, and California. They are about a 2026 shortage condition, where Arizona was assigned 512,000 acre-feet in reductions or contributions, Nevada 21,000 acre-feet, and Mexico 80,000 acre-feet. And they are about a year when federal drought sources reported record low snowpack in several Colorado River source states, with many runoff forecast points expected to produce less than 30% of average runoff. This is the stack: water level, storage, people, farms, power, shortage rules, snowpack, runoff. Each number belongs to a different part of the system, but together they point toward the same warning. The West is not only managing a water shortage, it is managing the rising cost of stability. That is why Lake Mead matters even when the lake still has water in it. The danger is not only the day a reservoir reaches some dramatic threshold. The danger is the long period before that, when every institution starts spending more money to prevent the worst outcome. Water agencies spend more to secure supplies. Cities spend more to prove growth can continue. Farmers spend more time deciding what is worth planting. Utilities plan around less flexibility. Households absorb the results through rates, prices, taxes, fees, and restrictions that may never say Lake Mead on the bill. That is what makes the crisis so easy to underestimate. A family does not receive a notice that says, "Your cost of living is rising because the Colorado River system has less margin." They receive separate signals: a higher water charge, a more expensive grocery trip, a city asking for conservation, a utility planning new resources, a housing market where every new development has to answer harder questions about long-term supply. One number looks like a water statistic. Together, the numbers look like a cost of living map. But numbers can also mislead if they make the story too simple. Because Lake Mead is not a morality play with one villain. This crisis is not caused by one city, one farm, one law, one dry year, or one decision made by one group of people. The available data points to several pressures arriving at the same time. Drought matters. Heat matters. Snowpack matters. Long-term legal promises matter. Agriculture matters. City growth matters. Infrastructure matters. Conservation matters. And the way the West pays for water matters. That is what makes the crisis so difficult. A farmer may depend on the river to keep a crop alive. A city may depend on the river to keep homes, hospitals, schools, and businesses running. Tribal communities may be dealing with long-running water rights questions that are central to the future of the river. A utility may depend on the water system for hydropower. A family may depend on all of it without ever seeing the reservoir. So the question is not as simple as, who used too much? The better question is, what happens when a system built around confidence is forced to operate with less certainty? Because many communities have already changed. Some cities have cut per-person water use. Some farms are adapting. Water agencies have invested in conservation, reuse, banking, and long-term planning. But every adaptation has a cost. And that is the hidden problem. Even when the West does the responsible thing, it may still become more expensive to live there. Conservation is not free. New infrastructure is not free. Water recycling is not free. Negotiating shortage is not free. Moving water across hundreds of miles is not free. Protecting a growing region from an uncertain river is not free. Blaming one group makes the story easier. It also makes it less useful, because the real crisis is not just over who caused the shortage. It is over who can afford the solutions. Who pays for conservation? Who pays for new infrastructure? Who pays when farms cut back? Who pays when power planning gets harder? Who pays when cities need to prove they have water before they keep growing? And who pays when ordinary families are already stretched by rent, groceries, insurance, and utility bills? That is where Lake Mead becomes a national warning. Not because every American depends on this one reservoir, but because the pattern is familiar. A hidden system gets stressed. Officials try to keep it stable. The public sees technical language. Then later, the household sees the bill. The next chapter of Lake Mead will not be decided by a single storm. People sometimes wait for one wet winter, one strong snowpack, one season that makes the lake look better. And sometimes, that kind of relief happens. But relief is not the same as security. A wet season can raise a reservoir. It cannot by itself rewrite decades of demand, legal promises, infrastructure limits, agricultural dependence, population growth, and household affordability pressure. The current operating rules for the Colorado River system are approaching their end after 2026. That means the West is entering a period where states, water agencies, tribes, farmers, cities, and federal officials have to decide what the next version of river management looks like. This is not a small technical update. It is a fight over the future cost of stability. Federal records show the post-2026 process drew more than 18,000 public submissions. That number matters because it shows how many different interests are trying to shape the next version of the river. For cities, the river is growth. For farms, it is production. For tribes, it is sovereignty and long-promised rights. For power users, it is hydropower planning. For households, it is the invisible infrastructure behind everyday life. And there is another reason this next chapter is so uncertain. The river depends on the mountains before it reaches the reservoir. In 2026, federal drought sources warned that snowpack and runoff conditions in parts of the Colorado River system were extremely weak. Reclamation also warned that, without major intervention, upstream conditions at Lake Powell could approach levels that threaten hydropower generation. That matters for Lake Mead because these reservoirs are connected. When officials protect one part of the system, they may shift pressure to another part. When more water is held upstream, pressure can move downstream. When water is released from other reservoirs, it may buy time, but it does not create a new climate. When conservation saves water, it can protect the system, but someone still pays to make that conservation possible. Federal drought experts have warned that summer monsoon rain may improve short-term drought conditions, but may have little influence on the reservoir level problem in the Colorado River system. That means the future cannot depend on one lucky season. It has to depend on hard choices. Choices about growth, choices about agriculture, choices about conservation, choices about power, choices about who pays now to avoid a worse bill later. And for ordinary families, that is the part that matters most. They may never attend a water board meeting. They may never read a federal operations document. They may never know which reservoir release changed which forecast. But they will know whether their city becomes more expensive. They will know whether utility costs rise. They may feel it when food systems become less predictable. They will know whether housing in the West still feels possible for a normal household. The next fight is not just over water. It is over who pays for stability. The final image of Lake Mead should not just be a dry shoreline or a stranded boat ramp. The deeper image is a subdivision at dusk in the desert, with the lights still on, a kitchen faucet still running, a grocery store still stocked, a farm road stretching toward fields that still need water, a power line crossing the dry hills, a family sitting at a table with ordinary bills, realizing that keeping normal life normal is getting harder. Lake Mead still has water. That matters. This is not a story about a lake that has disappeared. It is a story about a region learning what it costs when the margin disappears. And that cost does not arrive as one dramatic bill. It arrives slowly, in rates, in restrictions, in infrastructure, in food systems, in power planning, in housing decisions, in taxes and fees, in the quiet feeling that a place can still function but no longer feel affordable in the same way. For decades, the West promised a certain kind of life: sunshine, space, growth, new neighborhoods, open highways, food grown in unlikely places, cities rising in the desert, a future that seemed expandable. Lake Mead was part of that promise. Not because every person could see it, but because the water stored behind Hoover Dam helped make confidence possible. Confidence that the system could keep working. Confidence that tomorrow would cost something like yesterday. Confidence that growth could continue without forcing ordinary families to understand the river behind their bills. Now the lake is asking a different question. Not whether the West can survive, but how expensive survival becomes. Not whether cities can adapt, but who pays for adaptation. Not whether farms matter, but which farms can afford a drier future. Not whether families will still live in the West, but what normal life will cost them when the water system behind that life has less room for error. That is why Lake Mead is more than a reservoir. It is a mirror. It shows a region that is still alive, still growing, still working, still lit at night, but carrying more hidden cost than the old image of the West ever admitted. And the warning does not end at the shoreline, because all across America, hidden systems are being stressed in ways ordinary families only discover later. Insurance, electricity, housing, food, water, infrastructure. The pattern repeats. A system gets strained. The official language sounds technical. The public is told the problem is being managed, and then, slowly, the cost shows up at home. Lake Mead is one of the clearest warnings because the mark is visible on the canyon wall. But the real mark is on the household budget. The lake is the visible crisis. The bill is the warning. And if this is what water risk costs before the tap runs dry, it leaves us with a much bigger question. How many other parts of normal American life are already more fragile than they look?